This is Peter,
And this is Tom.
and you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcasts. All right, this is Peter Zablocki and Thomas Reska. Welcome back to the show. In lieu of, I guess, the new James Bond movie being pushed back.
In the Black Widow movie.
Yeah, right. That's getting pushed back too.
Well, it did, yeah.
So I think in lieu of those movies, we decided to do something that doesn't really get talked about that much. And while you watch a lot of movies that are spy thrillers, and there's a lot of books and whatnot about famous spies, and there's actually a lot of famous female spies in history.
Mm-hmm.
So we decided we'll kind of cover them today. So we're gonna try to center this conversation on famous female American spies. However, we'll also throw in some of the more famous spies from other countries and
Well, the
different
countries from major time eras, obviously, we're going to be looking at some Revolutionary, Civil War, obviously World War One, a little bit, World War Two, and Cold War, and even some modern ones that are actually have happened in recently. Obviously, if they're modern, but yeah, it's really what I'm doing a lot of the research for this. It's like you always have like that pop culture, like we're talking about the James Bond movies and the Black Widow movie. So you have that popular culture idea of like the spies, but the reality of the female spies is actually extends far beyond anything that like the movies were kind of showing.
So the first one is the famous Agent 355 or Agent 355 in the American Revolutionary War. All we really know is that she was the code name 355, and she was part of George Washington spy ring called the Culper spy ring, and that spy ring was out of New York. We actually still don't really know this woman's identity. What we do know is that Agent 355 was instrumental in catching the one and only Benedict Arnold.
Oh, really?
She was apparently very close to British Major, and it was this British Major who kind of had the secret dealing with Benedict Arnold. And Benedict Arnold was trying to sell plans to West Point.
Yes.
Before it was a military academy, it was a fort essentially that guarded the entrance to the Hudson. And
They're very important. And he was angry because he wasn't getting promoted as fast as he thought.
yeah. So she was kind of apparently really friendly with him. And there's, historians are still trying to figure this out. Like I said, they don't really know exactly who she is. But there is this idea that she was either like his lover, or there's also now some historians are claiming that maybe potentially she actually was Miss Shippen, aka Benedict Arnold's wife.
Wow.
Because apparently Benedict Arnold's wife was having a kind of an affair with this British major. So we don't know. However, historians, for the most part, believe that she's the one that passed information to Washington that Major John Andrew was in New York meeting with Benedict Arnold. That's how they caught him. Once Benedict Arnold was captured, he supposedly figured out that she was the spy, well, whomever she was. And she was captured and she was thrown on one of the infamous ships, prison ships that they had off the New York Harbor, which was apparently really, really bad. So yeah, so that was Agent 355. And then there's also another, female spy from this time period, and that's Anna Smith Strong. She was also part of the Culper spy ring, which directly reported to George Washington. She supposedly worked alongside Agent 355. She had a very interesting communication system. So this entire spy ring, there was one particular person that would bring their boat to Long Island. And like whenever he dropped his boat, he would bring information in and then bring information back from New York. The boat had 6 different drops, so he would never be caught. So he always stopped at 6 different places on the river. And the way that Miss Anna Smith Strong participated in this is she would actually put out her laundry on her line every time that there was a delivery on like Thursday or Friday. And the amount of clothes that she would hang on the line was corresponding to which drop site this guy was bringing his boat to, so this other guy could bring him the information to smuggle out of New York. Put up 3 pairs of pants on the line. That means he was at drop number 3. So no one caught on to that, apparently. You also have another...
But no, these are interesting. I really want to say, like, yeah, again, like, these are interesting because they're ones that if we didn't really do this sort of, they're not names really in the history books or names that you're really going to find unless you're doing these side research projects.
Yeah.
And but yet they're important. They have major impacts. That's what I was when I'm reading about some of the ones that I was looking up. They have major impact on major events that took place, and they're really the reason that they weren't talked about or their names aren't synonymous in history is really because they're women and because they were spies too, and they
Yeah.
kind of just in the shadows behind the scenes.
Yeah, no, Anna Smith Strong was instrumental in essentially
I've heard her. Yeah.
giving George Washington detailed information about troop movements in New York City and the vicinity. And ultimately he was able to chase the British out of New York. Two other ones that I think I should mention when it comes to American Revolution. One is Anne Bates, and she's interesting because she actually
I did see her.
spied. Yeah, she spied for the British. So she acted. She was a loyalist. We know that now through history, but she lived in Philadelphia. She was a school teacher. What she did is she kind of posed as this peddler, like selling, used, supposed like leftover knives, needles, dry goods, anything that American military soldiers might need. Under the cover of the fact that she was this innocent school teacher, she would go into soldiers, camps, and she would sell all these things. But really, what she was doing is she was writing down information that she would later on pass on to the British. There's no real information as to whether she was instrumental in anything really hurtful to the Patriot cause. However, she is the only British American spy that we know of from
No,
this
and
conflict.
again, it's
That
probably
hit
there had to
England,
be others, but yeah, these are the
of
ones that kind
course.
of their names survived. Yeah,
And then there's Lydia Darragh, Darragh. I assume the H is silent. Darragh. This lady has a really interesting story. She kind of employed all her sons to help her with her little spy ring. The British officers started using a large room on the second story of her home for military meetings, and that's usually what happened if you had a nice home in the vicinity and the redcoats came. That's
they
a
took it.
quartering
Yeah,
act,
that's a corner. Yeah, I was
quartering act,
just gonna
literally.
say.
There,
Yeah,
yeah. So they repossessed her house, and they lived upstairs in her house. So what she did is she just kind of capitalized on the opportunity, and she started gaining information and listening in on all these military meetings that they had. The way she did it, she would actually hide in like a small closet. And as these guys were filing into the room, she would stay in the closet and just literally take notes on everything that these soldiers were saying about battle plans and so on. And then what she would do is she would code those messages of all these battle plans on like little tiny pieces of fabric, which she would then sew on to buttons, like on a coat. Because back then the buttons were plastic; they actually were like made out of material. So she would put these messages in the button, and then she would cover the button with the material, sew it on the back, and then sew the buttons onto her teenage son's shirts or whether they
hmm
were vests. And it was her sons would then go and visit the old his their older brothers, and then they would take these buttons and present them with these clothes. They would bring them over to the patriots and their soldier camps, and that's how she would bring over this
all that
information. She
information.
employed all her sons, and she would sew it into the buttons, which I thought was kind of interesting. These four are kind of the ones that history remembers from American Revolution. But the Civil War definitely seemed to be the Confederate paradise when it came to
Yeah, I
spies.
found a couple on both, obviously, and you can. I'm sure there's many more that neither one of us were able to find during our research. But they definitely, I saw there was a lot of Confederacy because they had that strong feelings, about the South, about their cause, and their husbands were all away fighting. Not that that wasn't happening in the North, but the North had a lot more younger men or men who were not yet wed, or if they did, it was just a different dynamic, different population than what you had in the South.
Mhm.
So a lot of these women who married these older men at younger ages were just indoctrinated with the Southern Belle type of personality, that Southern Belle, the whole idea of being a Southern Belle, being a lady, and things of that nature. And they really played that up. And because they were seen as that, that's one reason why they were able to get a lot of the access and get this information that they were able to get. A lot of times they're caught and then they're let go simply because, well, you're a woman and we don't want to throw women in jail. Like that was also one
Yeah.
thing that I've noticed quite a bit as going through this. Yeah, but one of the big ones that I would talk about from the Civil War era was a young woman known as Rose Greenhow, and she was known as Wild Rose.
Yeah.
And she was known as that was her name actually just in high society, right around Washington D.C. She was a wife of a wealthy doctor, and it took a tragic turn in the late 1850s. Her husband died, and five of her eight children died in the 1850s. And right up before the Civil War broke out, she was a big supporter of the Confederate cause. And she created a big network of anti-union spies. And she was known as being really good at not only being charming, but being able to spark up conversation. And
Yeah, like
because
a
of
big
this,
hostess, right? It was
yeah,
like
she was
a
a big
yeah.
hostess. She would have all these parties, and that's the thing. She was in Washington D.C. in the time, and but she was a Confederate, and she wasn't known that she was a Confederate, that she was a supporter of the Confederacy. So she was having all these diplomats and politicians and generals come over to her place, and then secretly she would pass along all of the information that she overheard or was able to steal, and she passed it to Confederate generals and other contacts from that area. And she actually contained in 1861 she contained a whole bunch of information about the Union's army plan for Manassas, Virginia. And she actually sent her 16-year-old courier into Union territory with these coded messages tucked in her hair. He actually gave it to the Confederate generals. And President Jefferson Davis credited her for the Army's success of the first Battle of Bull Run, or the first Battle of Manassas,
Yeah, which
to
is
her.
really the first battle of
Yeah, first battle
the
of
war.
Civil War. Like they would not have been ready for that if it was not for her correspondence. But she knew about the troop movements. She knew how many troops they were going to send, and she was able to convey all that information to the rest of the Union
She
soldiers.
has an
I mean, the
interesting
Confederate
story
soldiers.
because
Well, yeah, as it goes on, yeah, because she winds up
yeah,
getting arrested. She does get arrested,
hmm
and then the Alan Pinkerton, right, the Pinkerton detectives, they basically
yeah,
come in there. They arrest her, and she's put under house arrest and everything like that. But she's able to leave, escape,
yeah.
and then she becomes a diplomat.
Like you said, they figured out she was a spy, and which another thing is kind of crazy because the first Battle of Bull Run could have ended the entire war. I
They should
mean,
have. They should have. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, the Confederates destroyed the Union soldiers and basically chased them back to Washington D.C. If the Confederate soldiers just kept on going, they would have invaded Washington D.C. First battle of the Civil War. So this woman, Rose Greenhow or Wild Rose, was instrumental
A
in that
huge,
very
huge,
first
yeah.
victory.
For Jefferson Davis and the other generals to say, "Listen, we don't win this battle. We don't have the success that we do without her." That's huge at the time
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
giving this much
and
credit
for a woman,
to
really,
a
too,
woman
at the
in the
time.
1860s. Absolutely.
When they Pinkerton Agency, which is like the first government federal agency that's formed, it's kind of like a not a secret service, but think of it as like I guess you're right, a detective agency. So the Pinkertons figure out that she is the spy in Washington D.C. and all they do is just place her on house arrest. Like
Yeah.
what crazy again? It's almost the idea of not taking her seriously because she's a woman. So what happened is she gets released, in 1862. Right away, she's hired as a diplomat, as you mentioned, and she's sent over to Europe to essentially get money.
She meets Napoleon. She meets Queen Victoria.
Yeah,
Now there
that's
was
where
no
she meets
chance.
some British guy, right? Doesn't she
Yeah,
meet some
she
British
meets a
guy and
British
get?
guy. She gets married. She publishes her memoirs.
Yep.
And then she decides, all right, I'm going to come back in the 1864 back to America. As she's coming back, her ship gets attacked by Union forces off the coast of North Carolina, and then
And
she tries.
this is like a weird story, right? The end
Yeah,
part.
well, she tries escaping in a rowboat, but she actually drowns because what happened was inside of her dress and her clothing, she had all these. She had gold like sewn into it that she was trying to smuggle in to help fund the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And she had all these also notes for Confederate leaders. It prevented her from being able to swim, and that's when she eventually drowned.
Yeah.
So her love for the Confederacy and her loyalty to it also cost her her life.
Another one I'm sure you have is Belle Boyd.
Bell
Did
Boyd,
you?
yeah, mm-hmm.
Yeah,
She was
Isabel
an
Belle Boyd.
interesting one, yeah,
She had a crazy. I mean, again, she was also a Southern loyalist, and she was a spy for the Confederates. And her story has like a very tragic beginning. I mean,
yeah.
a man. The idea is that a man invaded her home.
A Union
Um,
soldier, yeah.
Union soldier invaded her home. Yep, and like tore down her Confederate flag that she had, and spoke offensively to her mother. And Belle was only like 17. We don't know the exact truth of what this soldier was attempting to do to 17-year-old Belle and her mother, but what we do know is in retaliation and to protect herself and her mother, Belle basically took a gun and shot this Union
And he
soldier, and
shot him,
she
yeah,
she
yeah.
killed him.
And she was
And
acquitted though. She was acquitted of
she
the
was.
crime.
After that, it was kind of like that's when she decided, you know what? Forget this, right? Like I'm gonna do anything and everything in my power to help the Confederate
Yeah,
cause.
her. I think she had less love for the Confederacy than she had hate for the Union because of this soldier. That's really what it was. She just wanted to somehow, whenever more stuff probably happened than what we're able to find out,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And it's kind of like lost to history, but she's definitely being, seeing that guy and all the Union soldiers. So I'm going to get back at him
Hmm.
by punishing the entire Union. Yeah. But she was young, 17 years old
Yeah.
when this took place.
What essentially happens after that is you have very similar situation of kind of like what happened in American Revolution, that you had Union soldiers that repossessed her house, right? It was actually in this hotel. I think she stayed in a hotel. She lived in a hotel, and the Union soldiers, specifically Union officers, stayed up in like the floor above her. So what she would do is she would start to eavesdrop on their meetings, and then what she would do is she would then ride through the night to Confederate forces to pass on the information that she heard. She supposedly, at one point, even started providing or giving her information directly to Stonewall Jackson.
Stonewall Jackson, yeah.
She eventually is caught, right?
They saw her doing this, yeah, because they're like, why
Yeah,
is this it was so obvious that was what she was doing. And they caught her, but she was released. A month later, they caught her again. And like, listen, you have to knock this off. And then, so after being caught, they just said, all right, know what we're going to do? You're banished to the South. We
yeah,
see you in the North again. That's it. And so she's banished to the South, which doesn't bother her at all. But then she also, following
following our
Wild Rose, she
yeah,
heads over to England in 1864, and she's to serve as a Confederate courier. She was intercepted by Union troops there, so she gets caught a third time. One of the naval officers, by name of Samuel Hardidge, actually falls in love with her. She's only 20 at this time, and they do get married, but he mysteriously died shortly thereafter. So I don't know if we want to look too into that.
yeah.
She does marry him. She has a child with him, and
Mhm.
he dies shortly after. And then there she just kind of just stays in England for a while. She writes her memoirs, which is a big thing back then. Her life story. At 20 years old, she writes a memoir, right?
Yeah.
And she becomes a pretty
Yeah,
successful.
like what would you write at your 20
At
at 20
20,
life
I
memoir?
have no idea.
I prestiged this many times in Call of Duty on my PlayStation 3.
I was never a Call of Duty guy, but yeah, something. I don't know, something. I know what you're saying. Yeah, I don't know the video
Yeah.
games. And at 20 years old, I have no idea. I also, yeah, wasn't going across the Atlantic at 20. But
Yeah, no.
she actually becomes a very successful stage actress.
She does.
Yeah,
Yes, she does turn this into a career afterwards. And there's a couple more from this time, and then we actually have one that Elizabeth Van Loo.
she's a
I'm sure you
Union
found.
chick.
Yeah, she's for Union, but she was born in the South. I mean,
Yes, she's the opposite.
very
Yeah,
slave-holding, wealthy family in Richmond, Virginia, and then it's almost like her father probably didn't think this through, but they send her over to Philadelphia to go to school,
yeah,
which in itself at the time, sending young women to school, again, still kind of taboo in a sense. 1800, she goes to Philadelphia, and the school has a very big Quaker influence.
on her. Yeah, and that's against
Yeah,
slavery. She
yep,
becomes
and
an
it's very much
abolitionist.
yeah. So she becomes an abolitionist, and when she comes back to Richmond, Virginia, her father passes like 1840s, and she actually convinces her brother, right, to free the slaves, and they stay on as paid servants in Richmond, Virginia. It would becomes the capital of Confederacy, which is super unheard of and unusual. But when the war breaks out,
Yeah, I'm sure
go ahead.
there's a lot of books about her, and speaking one of those interesting little like mini series or
Yeah,
movies, something on Netflix. Because when war breaks out, her and her mother begin visiting a lot of the Union soldiers, the
in
brutal,
prison, right? In
the
prisons.
Libby prison,
Yeah,
which is a brutal Confederate prison camp.
we should
But
do a podcast on that, on like the prisons, the Confederate.
they were bringing clothes and food, medicine to them. They helped men escape. They smuggled in and out letters for them, valuables. As they were doing this, a lot of the soldiers that they helped escape tell the Union generals is what happened. So General Benjamin Butler recruits her as a spy, and she becomes the head of this massive spy network that's based in Richmond. A lot of her servants are helping them. Some of these other like famous female spies,
Hmm.
like Mary Bowser was a very important female spy
Yeah.
by herself. She sent coded messages, and they would do this using invisible ink.
Oh,
They
she
would,
was like the head of this like
yeah, yeah,
spy ring.
they would hollow out like eggs or
Eggs.
watermelons
Yeah.
or any type of like
Yeah.
fruit and vegetables. They would hollow it out and put the messages in that. Because again, no one would. They would sew it in their clothing because no one would really convince them what was going on here. And then when Richmond falls in April 1865, she actually flies. They said she's the first house to fly the American flag over her home. And then like the neighbors just got like really mad. Like that they were so angry about this. This was like right as soon as Virginia falls. Richmond Falls.
Yeah.
She's putting up the U.S. flag and like yes, yes, like she's all pumped up about it, and everyone else is like, how dare you? And she winds up becoming a pariah in her own community,
Hmm.
basically, and she becomes a postmaster general on
Under Grant.
their grant, and but she winds up being in poverty because she used up all of her family's wealth during this war for espionage to help smuggle soldiers out, bribe people like the Confederacy.
And it has a nice turn at the end of her life, though, right?
Well, it's one of those interesting turns because the family of a Union officer she assisted during the war happened to
From one
be
of these, yeah, from one of these prisons that she
from
was
these
at.
prison camps, but he also happened to be the grandson of Paul Revere,
Yeah,
which is one of those like crazy like connections in history. You know, this is Paul Revere's grandson. So he was wealthy, and he finds out about this, and he winds up providing for her until her death, and she dies in 1900, I believe. Yeah,
yeah.
1900. Yeah.
And I think the last one I have, I don't know if you have any more, but the one I kind of want to mention is Harriet Tubman,
Yes. Yeah.
whom I think is going to be on our currency, or it's supposed to be over. At least that was discussed, at least for the past 5 years, that she's going to be on one of our dollar bills.
I think that was kind of
I
postponed
was
for a while.
Yeah. So Harry Tubman is often known. I mean, if you say Harry Tubman, if you say it to a little kid, they'll be like Underground Railroad, and then they'll be like, Was it a choo-choo train?" And you're like, "No, the Underground Railroad was not actually a railroad." The
Yeah.
many times I have to say that, even in high school, I'm like,
Oh yeah.
"Wow."
Oh yeah. I know.
Um,
It is
but
what it is.
like
We're
not at
trying to
all like
fix it.
this.
We're trying to fix it.
Yeah, you were trying to fix it. That's right. A lot of people don't realize that she wasn't just like the most courageous Underground Railroad conductor. I mean, this is a woman that escaped slavery and then risked her life every single day, returning back into the South,
Yeah, it was she
back
got
into the
caught.
thick
Yeah.
of things, where she would have been caught and executed. The fact that she would put herself back in danger over and over and over again, and that's kind of what she's known for. But what a lot of people don't realize that in like early 1862, about a year or so into the war, she actually assembled like aspiring, I guess I would say
Yeah,
that.
sure. She had aspiring. She was like the head of basically aspiring that would go into Confederate lines and they would pose as servants or slaves
Yep.
and they would gather military information and slip back out. Yeah.
Because she's initially served as a nurse, right, and a teacher
Secret.
at different northern like military camps where liberated slaves would be, and that's where she kind of assembled in these Union camps from these liberated slaves. She assembled her entourage. It's amazing with the fact that these people escaped slavery and then under her direction went back. Again, not just Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman actually also conducted
Spy. She's a spy.
aspiring.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a couple for World War II. I mean, again, World War One.
Well, World War One does have. She's not American, but
But
it
she's
does have
considered the most famous one
the
as
most
well, right?
famous of all the female spies. Probably the one that made that pop culture version of a spy that we know today. The female spies.
Yeah.
Right. It was a Dutch-born spy. She was actually an exotic dancer, Mata Hari.
Yep.
And she was legendary for a lot of her close relationships to the military and political figures in Europe. Although there's some debate how much of a spy she actually was.
Yep.
So when World War I does break out, though, she basically had connections before the war, and she uses those connections during the war. And she was actually paid money by the Germans to spy on the French.
Yeah.
She claims that she took the money and ran away, and then agreed to spy for France, became kind of like a double agent. But that's something that is often
Didn't
debated
the
because the
French
British
actually
intelligence was the ones
execute
that
her?
actually arrested her.
The French executed her as a spy.
Yeah, the French were the ones executed because
Yeah.
they said, "Well, you never told us." The French also tried to hire her to go spy on the Germans, and
Yeah.
then she never told them that she was being paid at the time to spy on them by the Germans. So the French were like, "Well, which one is it?" And they just got up. It just tried her for that. When she says, "No, I'm not really a double agent. I'm just helping you out the whole time. I just took their money and ran away. That's why I'm telling you now." But like, why didn't you tell us sooner? And that was basically tipped off from the British intelligence. So the French arrested her. They accused her of being this double agent, and she was executed by firing squad. The whole point of this famous is that she refused to wear a blindfold, and she was
Hmm.
like staring at her executioners without flinching. So that kind of like
That's crazy.
added to her legend a bit
And
there.
whenever actually, this is an interesting sidetrack point because it wouldn't be our
That's what
podcast,
we
was
do.
it? When they did those executions, supposedly only one of the people on that line actually had a live bullet. One or two
Yeah,
people.
that's what they even did in the executions today when they do that.
Yeah, so you don't. So as a person,
But
that's
no one
when
knows.
they
Yeah,
execute. Yeah, like you're trying to execute somebody, you're that person with the gun. You don't know if you're actually the one that killed, did the execution.
The idea
Yeah,
is you can rationalize
if
it. Oh, it wasn't me. I
it
probably didn't.
wasn't my bullet.
Yeah.
Yep, it wasn't my bullet because there's four of us standing here. We're all firing at this person, and only one bullet goes in. We don't know which one went in because three are not real. So that's an interesting side tidbit. But World War II, I feel like World War II is that's when countries and allies decide that, you know what, we need to utilize women. It's such a huge conflict that it would have been silly for them not to. So there's two intelligent agencies. You have the British SOE, which stood for Special Operations Executive,
Hmm.
and then you have the American OSS, which is the Office of Strategic Services.
It's like the grandfather of the CIA.
CIA, basically, yeah. It's what CIA was before it's called CIA. SOE, or the Special Operations Executive, the British version, was active in virtually every occupied country in Europe. They had native operatives in enemy countries. They aided resistant groups, monitored enemy activity. I mean, these guys were all over the place as a spy network, and a lot of their spies were women. And then the OSS kind of overlapped those operations, right? But it also had operatives in the Pacific theater. That was the major distinction. Most of the times, these guys employed, I would say, ordinary women, men and women that they would try to get to pass on information.
Anyone they could find.
I think the most famous American spy, female spy from World War II, I don't know if you agree with this, is Virginia Hall.
Regina Hall, yes. She was also known as the most dangerous Allied spy, I believe, right? That was what she's
She
kind of.
was. Oh, the Germans had like literally made her the most. They actually made her the most wanted spy,
Yeah.
and they called her the woman with a limp or Artemis.
Yeah, but she had a wooden leg.
Yeah, she did. She had a wooden leg. I'm kind of getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but
Yeah.
Virginia Hall is intense, right? So born in Baltimore, Maryland, comes from a really privileged family. Was like a super outdoorsy girl. Attended fine schools, colleges. She wanted to be a diplomat. And in 1932, she lost part of her leg, right, in a hunting accident. She resigns from the State Department by 1939, which is the year World War II begins, with Germany's attack on Poland. She was in Paris when this started, when the
She's an ambulance
invasion.
driver, right?
She's in the ambulance corps. Essentially, when the French government falls and the kind of fascist Vichy government in France takes over, she moves to England, right? And then when she moves to England, she somehow uses connections and gets involved with the SOE. They send her for training, and then they return her back to occupied France. She goes in and joins the French resistance as the British operative, and she's American. We should mention that. But then the Nazis catch on to this resistance, and she has to escape. So they said she escaped on foot through Spain, like
In,
mountains, climbing,
in,
crazy
in
stuff.
the winter.
Yeah, in the middle of winter, while she has one leg. You
Outdoors
know,
person. So this was she had that experience because that's not something that like anyone could just do.
So then she returns to France. And essentially what she did in France is she kind of was I guess, the linchpin or the connector between the underground resistance movement and Britain.
She was a They discuss. Well, she goes to Britain. She
Yep.
escapes to Britain. Yeah, and like you said, she goes back to France. And but when she goes back to France, she disguises herself as a peasant woman with gray
Yep.
hair, dye her hair gray and everything like that.
Yep.
And like you said, she's that linchpin. She's basically like a radio operator, and
Yep.
she's monitoring German intelligence, organizing like drops of supplies
Yeah,
for the
even after D-Day. I mean, she's the
even
one
after.
that
Yeah,
creates yeah, she's the one that creates drop zones, like draws maps for them.
yeah.
And she's also the one that goes from house to house and finds safe houses for a lot of these soldiers. So she kind of makes connections with locals.
Networking. She's networking, and that's what she's doing. Yeah.
Yeah, monumental in the invasion, U.S. invasion of France. German occupied France. It got to the point that you're right, she became infamous to the Germans. Like they tried their best to capture her, and what made it so difficult is the fact that she taught herself to walk without a limp.
Yeah, so they wouldn't be able to find her.
Yeah, because they knew her as the woman with the limp. So she somehow taught herself with one leg to walk without a limp. But like you said, she would disguise herself all the time. She was like the Sherlock Holmes at the time. She just completely disguised herself, and they just could not find her. She was eventually awarded a bunch of medals.
Rightfully
Uh,
so. Yeah.
yeah, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross by General William Donovan for her efforts in France and Spain. It was the only award to any civilian woman in all of World War II.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and then after the war ends and the OSS stops being OSS and becomes CIA, she kind of transitions for a little bit. She continues through OSS until CIA, like 1966, couple years over. and then she transitions to the CIA, and then she retires. She passed away in 1982 back in the United States. So crazy story.
Yeah, absolutely. Again,
Uh,
one that I think they should make like some like a little mini series about this. I'm sure they have, but
yeah,
a
we're just
better one,
pro- we're
a
just,
newer one.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, we're just late to the party here. Any other ones they have from World War II?
I found out of other ones, but then they were not American. So if you want to,
Well, there's one other one that was Barbara Lewis. Barbara
okay,
Lewis was she was a WAC, Women's Army Corps initially. So the WACs would go into different towns and have these rallies to try to get women to join. So she joins, and while she's officially part of the Women's Army Corps, she actually winds up receiving a Bronze Star for her OSS work. She worked for the OSS, and she would be instrumental in using German prisoners for counterintelligence. Right, it was known as Operation Sauerkraut. She actually trained them and was in charge of this. They would take German prisoners and they would turn them, in promises of, hey, when war's over, you could come back and live in the United States, kind of thing. And they would create these fake passports for them and essentially release them back behind enemy lines, release them back to Germany to infiltrate German units and spread what was known as black propaganda about Adolf Hitler. So they would spread, there would be leaflets and signs and other things that would just pop up randomly, amongst German soldiers in their camps. And the Germans couldn't figure out what was going on, but really it was these quasi German soldiers that were really working, through this Operation Sauerkraut for the OSS to spread as much doubt in the minds of German soldiers. Yeah, like, hey, you're going to lose. It's kind of like what they had that
yeah, like Tokyo Rose in
Tokyo
Japan.
Rose, that's what it was. They would play popular music on the radio that the American GIs could pick up, and you would have this American woman that would be working for the Japanese that would say, "Hey, what do you think your sweetheart's doing back home? She's probably with somebody else. She
Trying to
probably left
demoralize
you."
them.
Yeah, it just kind of demoralized them. And Germany had the same thing.
Yeah, it's very common. This
Very
is what
common.
this is what you did. All right, I have one here. It was known as Churchill's favorite spy,
Hmm.
Krista Starbeck. And if I'm saying that correctly, you would know a little bit more than I
I
do.
would probably know a little bit more. Yeah, no, but that's good. Go ahead.
Basically, though, she was a daughter of Polish royalty. Her mother was Jewish, so that kind of like also limited how far they could go,
Hmm.
right? The aristocrats. But her father taught her everything: horsemanship, shooting. So she was really skilled outdoorsman. But her biggest skill was she was great at charming men, and she had all these admirers and stuff like that. It actually wound up leading to her death. She was later, years later, after World War II, she was stabbed to death by one of her admirers. But
Hmm.
yeah, but what basically happened? She was overseas when the Germans invaded Poland. It's the beginning of World War II, and she kept on trying to enlist in the army, but she obviously couldn't do it because she was a woman. So she was in London. She presented a plan to the British Secret Service that she would ski into Nazi occupied Poland, and she wanted to deliver propaganda. She wanted like positive news about the fight against Hitler, the fuel the resistance. Because remember, at this point, the Polish government fled the country, so the only way that the people in Poland were going to get any sort of positive information was from these spy networks or from these people smuggling this information in. And she actually convinced another Olympic skier, Jean
Hmm.
Maroskwas, to escort her through the mountains from Hungary, and it is in the cold of winter. And they would just kill Germans. They basically just camped out in the woods, skied around and killed Germans. And the Germans, it was a very cold winter, so the following spring, they found bodies all over the place. So they doubled their patrols the following winter because they knew that this spy network, these assassins were coming back. And she was obsessed with danger. She loved that they'd taken like really dangerous missions, smuggling intelligence in and out of Poland. She actually, at one point, to evade execution and capture, she chewed her own tongue bloody
Really?
to make it look like she had tuberculosis. They would just leave her alone and be like, we don't want to get that close to her because they don't want to catch tuberculosis. So that's what she would do. Just like make her tongue suit. She was just chewing her tongue bloody. Towards the end of the war, she found out that one of her lovers was was being held in this prison. So what she did was she would stay outside the prison and just sing and sing and sing until finally the guards were like, all right, what's going on? So they let her in. And then she lied, saying she was related to a British diplomat. They said she was related to like Churchill or someone like that. And that she's saying, listen, you guys know the reports. You know the Allies landed in France. They're going to be coming here soon. And the only way you're going to get mercy is if you release all these prisoners. And eventually they agree. They just let them all go. They let all these prisoners go at the
Hmm.
prison because she convinced them that she knew people and it was the only way they were going to be saved. And later on, Churchill's daughter Sarah wanted to make a movie about Krishnana, and they asked her, like, "Why do you want to do it?" It was because she said that was my father's favorite spy, and that's kind of how she kind of got that name. Churchill loved her, like loved the information she was all the stuff that she was doing.
There's actually a few women, American women, that participated and work for the OSS, but not as in the traditional sense as spies. They just work for the agency itself, and they did some really interesting things. And some of them are actually kind of famous. At least you became famous afterwards. One was Julia Child. She eventually becomes a very famous American like cooking teacher,
Talking
author, and
Julia Childs, yeah.
yeah,
So yeah, that's right. She was a World
yeah,
War. I remember that.
yeah.
Yeah,
So while she was trying to get into the wax, they turned her down because they said she was too tall. She was 6'2".
yeah.
So they're like, well, she's like, well, I want to help my country, and they're like, well, you're too tall. That's ridiculous, right? So she instead applies for the OSS in Washington D.C. and gets in. Okay, remember this is a woman that becomes very famous for cooking. She spearheads this workable shark repellent that was used by downed flight crews, eventually even for U.S. space missions as well, like water landings. She worked for the OSS. You know how like James Bond has a bunch of these gadgets. Like she created a gadget basically,
She was a
which was
gadget.
a shark repellent. Yeah, if you get shot down, and eventually, obviously she becomes a famous cooking TV personality. Marlene Dietrich. She was actually a famous actress at the time. She was of German descent, and she participated in these radio broadcasts that were aimed at Germany, something what we were talking about, but from our perspective. And she would say them in German, basically, and she would spread this propaganda that kind of was devised by the OSS to have just lower German soldiers' morale and kind of promote defection and stuff. So she was like our version of Tokyo Rose towards Germany. Everything in German, even though she was a German American. That would kind of make the soldiers want to quit and go home. She was awarded the Medal of Freedom by the United States. Then there was Elizabeth McIntosh. She was a war correspondent, right, and just an independent journalist. But then she joins the OSS right after Pearl Harbor, and she becomes instrumental in the OSS. This deception where they would intercept postcards by Japanese, from Japanese troops and vice versa, and their family members. And she would rewrite them. So she would kind of, I guess, manage information between Japanese soldiers and their homes and vice versa, and tell the Japanese soldiers that what was happening at home was much worse than it really was, which I don't know how you could say that because we were bombing craziness out of Japan at this time. Of course, it was bad. She actually intercepted and detected orders of numerous sorts. Chief among them was a copy of the Imperial Order discussing terms of surrender, which was then disseminated to Japanese troops to try to show like, hey, your leaders are thinking of giving up. But Hedy Lamarr, famous actress, if anyone ever has the time to look up Hedy Lamarr, I mean, extremely beautiful woman, and often kind of viewed as, well, you're just not that bright. But in World War II, valuable contribution to the intelligence division. She actually co-produced an anti-jamming device for torpedoes.
That would help.
um yeah, so like it was like a clever way of like frequency hopping, so it prevented the interception of American military messages as well. She basically created Bluetooth, like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi as we know today. Look it up, guys. It's She was the pioneer in creating that, and then eventually that technology, the rights to it were essentially stolen from her because she was a woman. Until the end of her life, she tried to fight for the fact, like, no, I co-created the technology that became
Hmm.
Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. I guess we could kind of finish up with some modern spies. You have anything good for anything modern?
Well, probably one of the ones that I wouldn't say the most recent, obviously, but one that is fairly recent. If you want to just fast forward a bit, would be Anna Chapman, and this is one that actually was captured not that far from us, right in Montclair, New Jersey. Actually, she was basically a Russian intelligence agent. She's also a model, even in Russia now, so it kind of gives you an idea. She was known as that, and when she was caught, like all those late night TV shows, like Jimmy Kimmel and stuff like that, were saying like, why are we sending her this one back to Russia and stuff like that? Because she was red hair, very attractive, um, but she came to the United States because she was married to a British person through marriage. That's how she was able to get into the United States, and quickly was having an affairs and stuff like that. And she was basically trying to infiltrate business and governments, business and government companies,
Hmm.
and get insider information. And then she in New York City and a couple others, and she eventually got caught in 2010 and was arrested conspiracy, and she pled guilty to the actual charge, conspiracy to act as an unlawful agent of a foreign government.
Hmm.
And she was then exchanged. Basically, they caught when I say they, the Russians caught a bunch of our spies in Russia. So we just kind of did it's known as a 2010 Russia U.S. prisoner swap. They just kind of swapped prisoners. She went back. It wasn't just her. It was several younger, attractive women that were sent over here to basically their job was to start dating or get to know businessmen, politicians, but also the sons of these businessmen and politicians. That's really like get to know the sons, the nephews, and then work your way to the actual like head of the family type of things and get information from them, inside information on trades and stocks, inside information on like government dealings. It was more business than it was many military secrets. But she eventually gets sent back to Russia in 2010, and she becomes kind of a celebrity. She becomes a catwalk model in Russia. She works for a television series, creates her own television series for a while, and now she runs the youth council as a government employee.
Wow. Yeah. See, there's still female spies out there, and there's probably so many female spies and male spies.
If you're a female spy listening to this podcast, just let us know.
Yeah, of course.
We're not gonna tell anybody. We just want to know.
We'll just make another podcast about it.
All right. For one other thing, she actually proposed to Edward Snowden on Twitter.
Oh my goodness.
So,
Can't make
but
this stuff up.
he did not respond.
All right. I mean, again, I thought it was kind of interesting.
It's a part of history. It's a part of these stories. I know we don't have time to go, so we are missing so many others.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is kind of we're just kind of highlighted some of the more known ones, and not necessarily known that none of these names you would kind of they're not like James Bond. You know what I mean? They're not that popular, but they should be, and perhaps maybe one day they will be. But I think that it was important for us to bring awareness to the fact that there's a lot of famous women spies out there. There's a saying that behind every great man is a greater woman.
Yes, this is some proof about it right here. Yeah.
Yeah, right there. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed our podcast.
Check out the website, History Teachers Talking Podcast.
We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Thanks for listening, guys, and we'll see you next week.
Take it easy.
I hope everyone enjoyed our podcast, and if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.